My name is Nicole Lamberson, and I'm a physician assistant, and I work doing outreach for the film Medicating Normal. Today, we have a special guest, Beverley Thomson. She is a writer and researcher and speaker with a focus on psychiatric medication, including antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and ADHD drugs, their history, how the drugs work, adverse effects, dependence, withdrawal, and development of patient support services. Her aim is to help inform and empower the patient to make informed choices about medication. She has a particular interest in withdrawal management and prescription drug-induced suicide. In the past 10 years, she has worked with organizations such as the British Medical Association, the Scottish Government as part of a working group addressing the issue of prescribed drug harm and dependence in Scotland, the UK Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry, where she writes evidence-based summaries to be used by professionals and the general public, and the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group for Prescribed Drug Dependence. She has contributed to articles in the British Medical Journal and mainstream media. And finally, and very excitingly, she is the author of a new book called Antidepressed. I have it here. A breakthrough examination of the epidemic of antidepressant harm and dependence. And that just became available January 4th of this year. So Angie is going to put the link to the book in the comments section in case anybody wants to check it out and get a copy. I urge you to. I have read it, and it is a super comprehensive book and extremely well written, and it goes into so many things which we're going to talk about today in this interview. So hi, Beverley, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Nicole.
All right.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you.
Absolutely. So before we get started, I just want to say to Beverley, let me know that her internet sometimes cuts out. So if that happens, we'll just wait and she'll sort of reload and come back. So I guess first, after your long introduction, is there anything else that you would like to add or share about yourself? Or if you watched the film, the book that you just put out, please do.
I think probably just one thing that I would like to say is that I don't actually say that people shouldn't take psychiatric medication, but what I do say is they should be informed about it. So that's my stance. So I just want to make that clear.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's sort of jump into the interview questions. So I guess first, why did you decide to focus on this topic at all, especially antidepressants? How did you become interested in the topic of psychiatric drugs at all?
Well, quite some time ago, someone said to me, when you realize something is wrong, you have a responsibility to tell others. Mm-hmm. And I realized very early when I started to do this work that many things are very wrong and that patient experiences paint a very different picture to the experiences that the psychiatric industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the medical profession paint. So the more patient experiences I read and listened to, the more I realized that voices needed to be heard. So that's where I got the inspiration for the book. So Antidepressed is the first of 3 books that are to be written, or 2 more. And in recent years, many researchers and academics and organizations have done work, and I realized that there was nowhere where people could access the work that had already been done. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to write a comprehensive book where people could find that, but also I wanted to write it in a way style that wasn't academic or medical, so that everybody could access it and everybody could understand it. Yeah. And I wanted the book to enable us to become informed consumers. So I want Antidepressed to empower us and to see ourselves as consumers of these drugs, rather than patients with little or no autonomy.
Right. So just curious, what are the next 2 books then? Or do you?
Yeah, my next book is called The United States of Anxiety, and it's about benzodiazepines.
Okay.
And my third book will be about psychiatric drugs and children and suicide.
Wow. Okay. And before you got into researching about these medications and reading stories from patients, what was your background? I know, it's research, but can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Initially, I was working in a counselling role in schools. So I worked in primary schools and in secondary schools. And at the time, I started to realise that the way people were talking about children was changing very much. So I started to notice terms like that we hadn't really realised before were starting to be used, like ADHD, and people were saying, I think that child's got something wrong with them. And I also had someone that I knew whose daughter ended her life after starting to take paroxetine. So it was a combination of a few things that got me interested in the subject.
Okay, I see. So you're a critical thinker then. Most people, they just sort of go along with especially teachers and that kind of thing, just accept, I did too at one point, just the mainstream narrative that this is how it is. But I'm always fascinated to meet people who tell me like something switched in their brain and they really started to start questioning.
Yeah, I think I've always been a questioner.
So I guess next question is then you said something about us being consumers of antidepressants. Why do you think it's important we see ourselves as consumers of antidepressants?
Well, I think it's really important we do, because we live in the age of the consumer. Psychiatric drugs are a multi-billion-dollar industry, and patients are consumers of the products. And whether it be through insurance or taxation, we pay for the drugs we take, right? So in the age of the consumer, in nearly all other areas of business, we have been empowered by access to information about those products, and we've become more knowledgeable. We've become savvy consumers, and that means that manufacturers and producers have had to be smarter, and they've had to know how to answer consumers' questions. So the question, I suppose, is why hasn't this happened with the psychiatric drug industry? Pharmaceutical industry messages haven't really changed since the 1990s. Most professionals and patients still quote that we have a chemical imbalance, and and the marketing messages have remained because people haven't questioned enough. So that needs to change. That said, many people are starting to become better informed. And they are starting to ask, are these drugs effective? Are they safe to take? Are they worth having? But to be honest, people still believe in the age of doctor knows best, when in reality, doctor is still simply doing as he or she is told.
Right. Yeah. When you say that about consumers, it makes me think of something I always say. As someone who took medication myself and had an adverse reaction and horrible withdrawal syndrome to it, I found sometimes when I was telling my story, some people who were still taking the medication didn't want to hear it, or they pushed back and said I was like pill shaming, or, I'm sure you've heard all the things that we get for spreading this message. But I thought to myself, in much the same consumer way that you're saying, is why are psychiatric drugs different? Because when somebody buys something on Amazon, for example, they look at the ratings and stuff before they purchase the item. Or if your car, for example, your Toyota or your Honda has a dangerous recall of the seatbelt, you're grateful that they wrote you a letter and said, hey, something is dangerous about this. But with psychiatric drugs, it just seems it's such a different mindset, even though people are consumers.
Yeah, and you know, Nicole, even though, you know, nowadays, even the medical profession tell us, you know, we need to take care of our healthcare, we need to be an active member of our healthcare team. But messages haven't changed, have they? And you know, we still think of doctors and patients, we still think of prescribing and taking drugs, when actually what we should be thinking about is selling and consuming.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've never really, I mean, I've thought about it some, but not so much so that when you break it down like that. Yeah. So the next question is, with COVID, everybody has seen a sharp rise in psychiatric medications, not just antidepressants, but all of the psychiatric medications. So in your book, you talk about, just as you said, you know, the messaging hasn't changed. So back in the 90s, we had defeat depression campaigns and depression hurts campaigns, and that's how they sort of sold the drugs. And you warn in your book that we should be on the lookout for similar campaigns around COVID. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and what you think could happen?
Sure. Well, since 1988, when Prozac was introduced, I suppose we've been brainwashed, really, haven't we, by pharmaceutical marketing? They had campaigns in the 1990s which told us that we had a chemical imbalance, that a drug could fix it, and all our problems could be very easily cured. So at that time, they created a new kind of depressed patient. It was somebody who wouldn't have even considered them depressed. You know, it was somebody with very mild depression.
Mm-hmm.
So they created a market. So the question that I kind of ask myself is, are we going to create markets? And just as people's attitudes towards depression was changed then, are we going to see a new group of people who suddenly have attitudes changed and a new group of people who need drugs? So are we creating a new market? Are we going to see, we now have, of course, the media obsession with our mental health. We have so many more diagnosable mental health conditions that people can be diagnosed with.
Mm-hmm.
All this hysterical fear and worldwide, you know, talk of mental illness. Are we going to see people suddenly diagnosed with COVID-19 PTSD, COVID-19 anxiety? With it is very worrying that we're in a position where we might see, and we are already seeing, that psychiatric drugs are being prescribed even more because of the pandemic.
Right. Yeah. And so would your position be that, you know, it's normal to have anxiety and distress because we're facing something as scary as a pandemic? And
Yeah.
it's not, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's a difficult thing because of the way that the media are bombarding us with the mental health messages. But you know, we probably are experiencing natural reactions to what is an unprecedented crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And some people's lives have been really hard and they have been really tough. But is it also a time when we must start to ask ourselves, is this an opportunity for people to start to question whether prescribing psychotropic drugs for natural reactions is a good thing? You know, is it time to question if we're being strategically used by people who should be providing the services that people actually need, like psychosocial interventions? So I think there are it's an opportunity too.
Yeah. So speaking of, you know, other interventions, there's one chapter in your book that is basically about informed consent. And you talk about knowing not only the risks of antidepressants, but also the benefits. And so in some of the other interviews that I've done and things that I've read, I have heard other experts say that, you know, exercise and psychotherapy are as efficacious as antidepressants. And then they make the argument then, well, if they're as efficacious, why would you prescribe a chemical antidepressant at all, since it comes
Mhm.
with all this great risk. So in your research for the book and for all of your other work, do you think there are benefits of antidepressants that can go beyond exercise and psychotherapy, or is it pretty much they're all about the same?
Well, I suppose I should start by saying that, again, we've bought into the narrative that if there's something wrong with you, it needs fixing and a drug can solve it.
Mhm.
But it's down to the medical profession, isn't it? And it's down to patients to look at the alternatives. A doctor or a psychiatrist should always ask us to wait before prescribing medication. I mean, research tells us that most depressive episodes will run their course without any intervention. And I think there was a 2006 study at Brown University which said that 85% of people who go without somatic treatment recover spontaneously within a year.
Wow.
But we don't hear that, do we?
Mm-mm. No, we don't.
But I also know that if we are suffering, it's understandable that people don't want to wait.
Mhm.
So why do people turn to antidepressants? Well, the reason they turn to antidepressants is because although there are many alternatives worth considering before you turn to medication, like changing your diet, better sleep, drinking less alcohol, less screen time, gaining some hobbies, getting a pet, doing more gardening. That's kind of like saying we all live in the real world, isn't it?
Right. And some of it isn't, it's not quick,
Because no, absolutely not quick. And you can see why medication, because of the way that we're sold it,
Mhm.
is an option that people prefer. So
Yeah.
we in the UK are suddenly talking about social prescribing, where instead of a doctor writing, a prescription, they will send you to, do some gardening, or they will say. But the reality is, as much as we talk about it, it's underfunded and not really available very often.
Mhm.
Then we have to go to the question, why don't people have psychological therapy before they start on medication?
Mhm.
And the fact of the matter is that guidelines tell us we should have already had psychological therapy before we take medication.
Mhm.
But it's not happening. It's not available. And there are some really good statistics in my book about the US, actually, and the lack of therapy available. So we accept antidepressants because the benefits really are, widely promoted and the risks are downplayed. So for most people, it's something that they accept without very much question.
Mhm.
Um, There are common experiences that everyone have when they start to take antidepressants, but the one thing that a doctor never really tells us is that absolutely nobody can predict how an antidepressant will affect you.
Mhm.
Absolutely nobody. So I'll quote one study. There's a study, it was a very large study called the STAR*D trial. And it was real world patients. It wasn't industry funded. And even after 4 courses of treatment, only 38% of people ever responded positively.
Wow. Yeah, that's not a very good outcome, is it? Yeah.
Not really.
Yeah. So with your position on informed consent, saying like patients need to become better consumers, and me saying like it is human, I guess, to want something fast and quick. I also still sort of like cringe at the blaming of patients too. by saying like, oh, they should have known better, or they should have researched more. I mean, it is true. And I took the medications myself, so I can admit that I did not do as much research on them as I should have. But do you think that like, I mean, that they are innocent victims too in some way because of all of the marketing and the misinformation that they're provided?
Absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
one of the things it's only now, well, 1988, how many years, 30 odd years, or my maths isn't very good, that we are actually starting really to question. So now is the time where
Mhm.
things can change.
Yeah.
And I do not blame any patient, because life is tough. Life is really tough. But that's one thing that I wanted to do with my book, was make sure that there is information out there that's in an accessible style and easy to read, so that people can learn about these drugs.
Yeah. And the book was, I'll say, that's one thing I left feeling like you broke it down very simply and for the lay person, and you covered everything so comprehensively and in such a good
Thank you.
way. So I would recommend it for people thinking about taking an antidepressant, like family members of people who are taking them, especially like moms of, kids they're considering putting on antidepressants. Lots of people need to read the book for sure. So let's go into some of the risks that you talk about in the book, especially like the more serious and long-term ones that people need to be aware of as part of informed consent before starting the medications. And then if you have any statistics on like what percentage of people will experience adverse effects and withdrawal syndromes from antidepressants.
Sure. Well, the one thing that we have to say is, and it's common thread through all the experiences in the book, is that the one thing that most prescribers do not do is warn us about the adverse effects, and also warn us about the long-term effects of the drugs. So a doctor should always give us comprehensive information, and they should enable us to give informed consent. They must tell us why we're being offered the treatment, and they must tell us the harms and risks. But unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment is we're still, instead of informed consent, we call it manufactured consent, because they still base it on the chemical imbalance theory, which of course we know now is very questionable. So some of the more serious risks: varied, unpredictable and physical and mental states, feeling emotionally numb, feeling detached, distorted dreams, agitation, serious headaches, suicidality, major central nervous system problems, complex neurological effects, brain impairment. Sexual problems is a huge problem, weight gain, serotonin syndrome, and things like alcohol dependence. I'll just quote from, if it's okay,
Mhm.
um, I'll just quote from John Steam, which tells us that over 70% of 1,431 people from 38 countries, which was the study, over 70% felt feeling foggy or detached, and over 70% feeling emotionally numb. Over 60% had a reduction in positive feelings, drowsiness, sexual difficulties, or feeling not like myself. And over 50% had withdrawal effects, distorted dreams, dry mouth, and weight gain.
Mhm. Wow. Yeah. So on the topic of informed consent, I always thought like, even if my doctor had sort of listed off some of the things that maybe they're taught in medical school about, possible adverse reactions and things to these medications, I still don't know if that would be considered like comprehensive informed consent. I feel like you almost have to talk to people who've actually taken the medications, and like you did all the patient reports that you have in the book to really get like the full picture. It's kind of like what Angie who also works for the film, says all the time, is like, you read in the pamphlet dizziness, right? And you think like, oh, you might get a little dizzy or whatever. But then if you talk to someone who actually took the medication and they say like, I couldn't stand up and I laid in bed for 2
Yeah.
years. And it's like much different than, what the impression that you're given.
Yeah, it's absolutely, like I said at the start of this, real life experience is incredibly different from what you might find in a patient information leaflet or what a doctor tells you. And
Yeah.
if you look at a patient information leaflet, there are over 200 what they describe as side effects for most SSRI drugs,
Mhm.
which is crazy. And how many people actually read it anyway? So there's
Yeah.
one thing in terms of risks. There's just one thing that I think it's really important that I mention.
Okay.
I call it the A word of antidepressant adverse effects, and that's akathisia.
Mm.
So it's a medication-induced state that people describe as kind of the epitome of losing their mind. It can cause a restlessness and an inner turmoil, agitation, paranoia, and sometimes it can lead to suicide. So it usually happens when people are starting, stopping, changing dose. And it can also happen when people are switching makes of generics, which we'll come on to later.
Mhm.
Um, and I was really interested to listen to your talk with Selma recently,
Mm. Yeah, she was
because
fascinating. Mhm.
yeah, it was really good, because a lot of these people who have akathisia when they first start to take the drug, it's
Mhm.
because they can't metabolize the drug. So we think that's now between sort of 5-10% of people.
Right.
And a lot of this has been missed with young people because they start to take the drug, they're not being monitored. So, I think it's one of the reasons that we really need more research into akathisia, although the Akathisia Alliance did provide some very good information that I have in the book. So
Yeah. Great. I'm glad you touched on that. I had akathisia myself, and it was an indescribable hell, a torture that you can't even, it's beyond the human experience. You can't even put words
yeah,
to it unless you've had it. So,
yeah. And I think one thing that we need to do is we need to look at one thing that I learned from talking to the people and reading the experiences of people.
mhm.
So many times that akathisia was diagnosed as first episode psychosis.
Wow.
So what we really need to do is we need to do some research and really work out how many episodes of first episodes of psychosis are actually akathisia. And I think we might be surprised.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, so you have a chapter in the book also called Dependence and Our New Balanced State. And you start out the chapter by talking about how dependence is not addiction, which I was so happy to see. That's like one of the things in my work that I've constantly tried to make a distinction between the two, because I feel like it's really a part of the confusion that
Mhm.
people don't know that they are not synonymous terms. Um, I've also heard people try to defend antidepressants by saying like, well, they're not addictive, not in the same way that benzos are addictive. So that's where, again, that confusion with terminology comes in. So if anyone's listening and they don't know what the difference between dependence and addiction to antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs means, can you clarify the difference, and then also what the consequences of dependence are?
Sure. Well, the National Institute on Drug Abuse describe addiction as compulsive drug seeking, continued repeated use, and that's despite the drugs being harmful,
Mhm.
and also long-lasting changes in the brain. But if we take antidepressants, we don't crave them.
Mhm.
There's no drug seeking behavior
Right.
doesn't usually have any effect on our ability to function socially. If you would like me to, I will read what I describe as dependence. It's actually a quote, but it describes it perfectly.
Sure.
So being dependent on antidepressants means we need the drugs to function physically and mentally in what has become our new antidepressed normal state. And we need to maintain the levels of the antidepressant in our system to stay in our new normal. Any reduction or changes to our antidepressant regimen can induce physical and mental adverse effects. The antidepressants we have taken to supposedly cure a chemical imbalance have instead created their own balanced state, which, without them, it's impossible to maintain.
Right. Makes sense. So I guess then what are the consequences of developing? I always call it physical or physiological dependence, because I feel like that sort of triggers people to understand more. It's like an actual physical process happening. So what happens when people develop that from taking antidepressants long term?
Well, no one actually knows how long it takes for somebody to become dependent on antidepressants. But what we do know, it can be as little as missing one dose when people can have symptoms where they begin to realize that they might actually be dependent on antidepressants. And one of the things that I always think about is that there are millions of people who say, antidepressants saved my life. Well, they might have saved their life, but these are millions of people who actually don't realize that they are dependent on the drugs.
Right. So are you saying then that the perception that antidepressants save their life is them just treating the withdrawal that they're having?
No, what I'm saying is that, as I described when I read from my book, they're in a new balanced state. And
Okay.
as long as they continue to maintain the same level of the drug and the same make of the drug, and then perhaps they can continue. But it's when things change, they might become vulnerable, which is what I talk about a lot in the book. And when things change, it's a totally different ballgame.
Right. Okay, so maybe then now go into how this state makes people vulnerable.
Okay. So imagine if you're dependent on antidepressants. So you need to be in a balanced state to continue to live a balanced life.
Mhm,
So imagine if you suddenly can't get them,
mhm,
if you can't access them, or if you can't communicate your need for them. This, if you can't get them, you're suddenly going to become very imbalanced. So having access to the drugs that we need can literally be the difference between life and death. And that
mhm,
sounds very extreme, but I can assure you from some of the experiences that I've heard and read, then this is actually true.
mhm,
So we're vulnerable if we're not properly informed about the drugs. So we're vulnerable if we don't give informed consent. If we get bad advice from doctors, we're vulnerable. The elderly can become very vulnerable if they have no support, if they're unable to make decisions or communicate their need for the medication.
mhm,
A young person can often become very vulnerable. Say, for example, they move away from home, they move away from their support system, they move away from the prescriber that they know. What if they haven't been told they might be dependent on their drug and they shouldn't stop it suddenly?
mhm.
Um, there are lots and lots of different ways that we can, if we're not able to afford our medication, we can become vulnerable. So it's
Right.
estimated that between 2.5 and 5 million people in the United States are struggling to afford psychiatric medications.
Wow. Yeah.
That
So,
that that's a problem if you're dependent. It's a real problem. And also, if you are being switched between different makes of drugs, you have a generic and you've been switched, sometimes the adverse effects from generics can make us vulnerable too.
Yeah, and that does happen. I mean, I just spent the other day calling pharmacies across the United States for a friend looking for a certain generic that we could not find anywhere. It just
Yeah.
suddenly was unavailable.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
the effects of these generics, I have people calling me who have become suicidal when starting a new generic. And
Yeah.
this isn't something that we need to underestimate. This is something that we need to seriously address.
Mm, okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about generic problems and stuff in a minute. But so you did mention briefly, just when we were talking about being vulnerable, when you develop physical dependence, that there's some more at-risk populations than others, like children and the elderly. What about those populations? What do they need to know specifically?
Yeah, I think it's time that we really start to question why we're, medicalizing the stre- the distress of children and then the elderly, often, without any biological justification. There's, to be honest, the pharmaceutical industry, and I have tried not to pharma bash in my book. I hope you appreciate that, but
Yeah,
we still have to say it as we see it.
right.
The pharmaceutical industry have viewed both sectors of society as mass markets.
Mhm.
And we've bought into it, to be honest. Children have become victims of the mass screening programs that we have in the US. And what
Mhm.
we have to think about is, if we look for something, 9 times out of 10, we're going to find it, aren't we?
Yeah,
And this whole culture, I think, has to change. To live in a world where we tell a child that they have a faulty brain and it's their fault that they're not happy, is probably not a good society to live in, is it?
right. Yeah. In Scotland, I mean, I don't know if you guys have it, but even you're talking about like expanding the markets and then, going after children and that kind of thing. What about pets? Do you guys give Prozac to your dogs and stuff over there like we do in the United States?
Well, no, not really. But to be honest, I was quite alarmed. There was a program that was on TV just last week, and it's one of those programs where an expert goes in and tries to sort out a dog's behavioural problems.
Yeah.
And they announced on TV that they were giving their dog drugs for and I was like, oh my God, it's
Yeah.
happening. It's
Right.
starting to happen. But no, it's not routine. It's
Right.
definitely not routine.
Yeah. Just us crazy US folk, I guess. So, okay.
But
So what about, yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to
That's-
say, parents have normally already bought into the fact that, we have a medical condition and we need drugs when their children start to have problems. But what they don't really do is, and it's if we think about it, all the things that we protect our children from nowadays,
Yeah.
these drugs have an FDA black box warning, you
Mhm.
know? And it's the first thing that parents should be looking at when somebody suggests that these drugs are powerful psychiatric drugs. So, there's a huge, there's lots of information that link the rising suicide risk
Mhm.
um, with children and depressants. So there are studies that show that it's almost double the risk of suicide thoughts and behaviors if they take medication. We have a site, I don't know whether you've ever heard of it.
Mhm.
It's called Antidepressed, and it has over 5,500 case studies
Wow.
related to antidepressants and suicide, and so many of them are children and young people.
Wow. Yeah. I think if parents really knew, like you said, the informed consent, and they knew the risk, they would never expose their kids to this kind of thing unless it was some extreme case, or something like that. But they just don't. It's back to that thing that we talked about earlier. Like, for some reason, maybe we're so numb as a consumer and as a society to all of the marketing and stuff that
Yeah.
we think like, oh, everything has a side effect, but we just take it anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the big problems is that, these drugs become gateway drugs,
Mhm.
because now what we're seeing is a huge increase in bipolar diagnosis with children with mood instability.
Right.
So, it starts with one drug and then it becomes another. And just like adults, if you start to take psychiatric medication, then it doesn't always stop with one drug.
Yeah. Yes, that is so true. So what about pregnant women? This is one thing that just gets me like, I can't even believe it. There'll be women that come into the support groups and say like, well, I'm pregnant and I'm really worried about my baby, but my doctor says to me like, don't worry, you have to put on your own oxygen mask first and take care of your own mental health, and it's safe for the baby. So what did your research tell you about pregnancy and antidepressants?
Well, that's exactly right, because most of the time doctors will probably tell people that the risk of not treating depression is far greater than the risk of antidepressants to the mother and baby.
Right.
Well, is it? And that's something that we have to ask ourselves. But it's a real dilemma, isn't it? Because a lot of people who become pregnant, if we go back to it, are already dependent on these drugs.
Mhm.
And there are some really, really frightening stories. And I hate to say frightening, but in my book, there are some stories, experiences of people who were pregnant and had to face the issue. And it's one of the things that I always say, this is one thing that, and I know it's not at the forefront of their minds probably when they're 18, 19. But
Mhm.
if you want to be pregnant and have a family one day, then if you choose to take antidepressants, you should stay on them for the shortest time possible. At some point, you will come to that stage where you have to decide what to do. And actually, coming off antidepressants while you're pregnant is not advisable, because we know that it's not an easy thing to do, especially if you've been on them for a long time. So it's not as simple as, do I stop or do I carry on if I'm pregnant? And you have to think that women in the US are actually twice as likely to be on antidepressants as men. So
Right.
it's a huge problem. There have been some studies, and some of them do point to babies being born with symptoms such as jitteriness, poor feeding, agitation, fast breathing,
Mhm.
and also autism, um, with mothers who have taken antidepressants during pregnancy. And there's one US study that says that uh, birth defects are 2 to 5 times more likely if the mother has taken, I think it's paroxetine or fluoxetine in the early years.
Wow.
Paroxetine has also been linked to heart defects, saying that the risk is very low and nobody should ever stop taking antidepressants if they find that they're pregnant suddenly.
Yeah.
Um, but the risks are very low and do seem very low. But I think, again, Nicole, it's something that needs more research.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you said that about, women who are getting these drugs at 18 years old. I mean, you might not be thinking about becoming a mother at that time, but as somebody who got put on these medications in my early 20s, and that is something that happened for me. I was so medicated
Yeah,
with polypharmacy that I could not have a family. And then my withdrawal syndrome was so severe and lasted for so long. Those are your fertile years. And we have a window as
yeah,
women You know, that should be, I mean, that is one thing. If I could talk to my psychiatrist again, who did this to me, I would say to her, like, what were you thinking? I was like a childbearing age woman, how did you see that I was ever going to get off of any of this stuff? But it's like, no one considers that or thinks about it.
Yeah.
So that is, if you're a woman, even if you're, in your teen years or whatever, this is something as part of informed consent we really need to start thinking about, and telling the girls.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, I think it's a very important issue, and I think we need specific education around that issue.
Yeah. So next question is, what are, in the book, you talk a lot about medically unexplained symptoms. I guess in the UK, is that abbreviated MUS or something?
Yes.
And
yeah.
How do antidepressants cause medically unexplained symptoms?
So this is a really common theme through the experiences that I write about in the book, or that are in the book. Doctors often fail to recognize or believe the physical and psychological symptoms or the adverse effects that a patient has when they're taking antidepressants. And what they do is they look for alternative explanations. And this often results in more examinations, more tests, more investigations, and usually they come back with negative results. So then they will label a patient's adverse effects as medically unexplained symptoms or unknown etiology, or the cause is unknown.
Right.
So then this leads to a further diagnosis of things like chronic fatigue syndrome, IBS, ME, fibromyalgia, and more drugs are prescribed. So this is becoming a very fast-growing area of research, as professionals and drug companies are actually capitalizing on the opportunities that adverse effects of drugs are presenting.
Oh my.
I call it opportunistic medicine, which, I'm probably not going to be very popular for, but I do call it opportunistic medicine. So we now think that 1 in 4 people who visit a general practitioner in the UK have medically unexplained symptoms. Wow. And 1 in 3 who visit a neurologist have them.
Okay. And do we know how many of those are taking antidepressants or psychiatric medications?
Again, we need more research,
Right.
but I can probably guarantee if they're seeing a neurologist, probably quite high.
Yeah.
And you can see this theme running very strongly through the experiences in the book.
Right. So back to the generics that we touched on briefly before. You talked about how, somebody could not find a certain generic, or they could be switched from one brand of generic to the other. What do people need to know ahead of time about generics?
Yeah, generics are causing a huge problem when it comes to psychotropic medication. And again, this is something that we really need to take very seriously. So once a brand name drug's patent expires, a generic drug using the medical name can be produced. So manufacturers anywhere in the world submit an ANDA, an abbreviated new drug application to the FDA to get approval to bring the generic drug to market. So sertraline could be made in June 2006 when the patent for Zoloft expired. Okay, so now we have sertraline, which is made in factories all over the world. So the problem is that we're being told these drugs are exactly the same. So all these drugs made in all these hundreds of factories, thousands perhaps of factories all over the world, we're being told that they're the same. But the problem is that they're only approved on similarity. So these companies do not get the drug registration file from the original brand drug. They don't have to do any clinical trials.
Mhm.
So what we're seeing is drugs that are similar but not the same. So these companies develop their own formulation basically for the drugs.
Wow.
So the quality of manufacturing is raising serious concerns in some parts of the world, and there's some very good books recently being written on the subject. So each time we might be receiving a different make of generic drug, and not only might the quality be different, but the bioequivalence of the drug might be different. So instead of getting 100% of the drug, we might be getting 80% of the drug, or we might be getting 110%. So it's not as simple as patients saying they don't work as well. This is
Mhm.
more serious when it comes to psychotropic medication, because there was in the Washington Post, I think it was in 2008, there was an article that said, did a switch to a generic cause a relapse? Well, it
Mm.
probably didn't. It probably caused involuntary withdrawal.
Mhm.
So these switching to generics are causing some serious adverse effects, which people and medical profession are failing to recognize.
Yeah.
So they're creating imbalances some of the time. And I've even had talked with patients who are actually reporting that they are suffering from akathisia if they have switched to some generics.
Wow. Yeah. Because if it can be, 20%, that's a large cut for somebody, a reduction in dose if it's lower than what they were taking before.
Yeah, and it's actually, can you imagine if you're going through a tapering regimen, so you need to be pretty accurate with the drugs that you're taking. So if
Right.
somebody is going through withdrawal, it's really important that they try and take the same drug, same make of drug. We really have to start accepting that some make of generics don't suit some people.
Right.
And I think it's important that people report if research.
Okay, so what I liked about antidepressed was there's a huge section on patient experiences in your book. Um, what are some of the common themes you noted when going through all the patient experiences and including them?
Yeah, the patient experiences were from my associate, Marion Brown, launched a petition with the Scottish Government to ask them to recognise and help people who have been harmed by or dependent on medication.
Mhm.
And it was amazing because we got people from all over the world writing their experiences and submitting. Um, so a key theme, I think, is that doctors don't often tell you about the drug side effects, and that's a problem, a real problem. We've talked about that already, but that's constantly throughout.
Mhm.
And one of the most important things are doctors are very keen to prescribe the drugs, um, but they're not very keen to help with withdrawal when it comes to it. So they're also often very keen to blame the patient and say that and assume that the cause of new symptoms lies with the patient and not particularly the drug.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lack of information given to patients about the risk of antidepressant withdrawal. That's throughout. Doctors failing to recognize the symptoms of withdrawal. Um, there are significant effects on functioning for those who experience withdrawal. Some very harrowing stories, actually. Doctors being poorly informed about the best method for tapering or the best way to help people withdraw.
Mhm.
patients being diagnosed as having a relapse if they stop taking and then being prescribed more medication. Patients, and a big thing is patients seeking advice out with the medical community. So looking at groups on the internet and that being the only place that they actually find help.
Right. Yeah, I remember that petition. I wrote my story in too. So that's cool that you had access to all of those stories.
Yeah, I'm going to cover, it was really interesting because a lot of them were benzo stories as well. So they will be in the next book.
Oh, good. Okay, so we've talked about some things where you say like we need more research. So I wonder, like, what are the most pressing questions do you think that still need answers when it comes to antidepressants?
There are so many, there are so many, but we need updated prescribing guidelines, and a lot of work has been done in the UK, but the US are way behind. And if we look at the APA guidelines, they're so out of date, and we desperately need updated prescribing guidelines. We need more research about the long-term effects of the drugs, because other than John Reed's study, I think there is actually very little. Informed consent, obviously, we goes without saying. We need education for the public and professionals about withdrawal and akathisia. We urgently need education about akathisia. That's not just for medical professionals, that's for all social care professionals, anybody who works in the emergency services. It's really important that we have, there's some good education out there, but we need more awareness. And we need to question the overprescribing and the unnecessary prescribing to children, to young people, the elderly, and I know it's and to veterans. I have a section in my book about veterans, and I am really quite passionate about this, and we really need to start asking questions, which I know you are doing, which is great. And again, and lastly, and last but not least, we need to do some research on the cheap generics that we're pumping our bodies with.
Yeah, very true. And one thing I would like to see is research on the different methods that people are using. Like you said, we had to go online and meet other people who taught us how to taper. So it'd be nice to know, like, does this method work well, or is this one better, or, how to get off of these things? What is the best way to do it,
Yeah, and the medical profession have to start listening to patients. They really have to start listening to patients, because they are the experts. They're the ones who've done it. They're the ones, and they have to start listening.
Yeah. So do you have a couple more minutes if we go over just for some questions from
Sure.
the audience? Okay. Somebody just made a comment and said, in terms of informed consent, psychiatrists will diagnose you based on their objectivity of what you subjectively say. These same psychiatrists, and this person says, I was an NHS psychiatrist for 25 years, so he is one himself, objectively follow the science presented by opinion leaders paid by the pharmaceutical industry. And that's from Peter Gordon, who you probably know.
Yeah, no, Peter.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for your comment. Okay. Somebody said, I'm very much appreciating your book. Can much of the information you write about antidepressants generally apply to antipsychotics as well, or is that just a whole different kettle of fish?
I can't comment on that because antipsychotics are not my area, so I'm really sorry, but
so maybe we can, provide a resource for that person where they can.
Sure. I'm sure I can answer. Yeah.
Okay. This person says, what support do professionals need? Why are they not seeking it out? They are paid professionals.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems is with this, and I can only speak from the UK and from the perspective of general practitioners. I am actually on their side, which sounds quite bizarre. They are overworked. They are bombarded with the mental health issues that are really not their job, to be honest. In a lot of they are general practitioners. They are not mental health practitioners. They are not psychiatrists, but they've been put in a position. I think it's 1 in 4 appointments now has some kind of mental health issue, and we really need to look at this and find a different way to deal with people's problems. But then again, it's a double. It's about educating the public too, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I
It's
always say providers or doctors, practitioners, they're victims too, in a way, because they're getting the same bad information and the
yeah.
studies have been manipulated and that kind of thing. So it's like a system-wide mess,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
it is absolutely. I think I call it a wicked problem at the beginning of my book, because there are so many complexities, and there are so many issues that are interdependent, and and one problem leads to another, and it's I don't know how we're going to solve this, but we're going to have to start by solving one problem at a time.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so last audience question. This person says they've been off psychiatric medications for 3.5 years and they're still having symptoms. Does your research validate that long-term damage? People are still suffering years after they've stopped taking psychiatric medication.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, early on in when we were talking, nobody can predict how these drugs will affect an individual, and I think that's the same for the long-term effects and the same after withdrawal. So it's very difficult to actually speak about an individual and how they will be affected. But yes, there are people who are still affected after years and years of coming off the drug, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess last question. So you've written this book and you've researched everything there was to read, and you put so much into writing such a great book. If you had a take-home message for prescribers and patients and maybe just potential consumers of antidepressants, what is your take-home message that you would like people to know?
Yeah, I thought about this and I decided to read something from the summary. Is that okay?
Okay,
Because
sure.
I think something that I wrote would probably sum that up. So this is probably one of the last pages of my book. So whilst governments around the world debate, medics remain willfully blind, and charities secure their funding, the change has to start with us as individuals, as advocates, and as informed patients. The fact that we know a doctor's appointment is often the start of a lifelong journey as a psychiatric patient with a stigmatizing lifelong condition and dependence on psychiatric medication means the shift starts by us questioning the overuse of antidepressants and looking at alternative ways to support and care for each other. It starts by becoming more knowledgeable, reclaiming some control and power over our own healthcare, and by taking responsibility to educate ourselves to the best of our ability. It starts by understanding antidepressants are not the easy and quick fix that makers and doctors say they are.
Yeah, very powerful and so true. That's a great take-home message that everybody should listen to for sure. So it looks like we are at time here. I'm going to have Angie put a link to your book again
Thank you.
in the comments in case people want to get it. I highly recommend reading it. And if you know somebody on antidepressants or who's thinking about it, this is such a comprehensive resource where they can get all the information in one place. If somebody wants to reach out to you, or do you have a website or somewhere where people can, learn more about your work or follow you on social media, that kind of thing?
Sure, I am just developing a website, but I have an email and I'm
Okay.
quite happy for anyone to contact me. It is antidepressed@btinternet.com. I can't always guarantee that I will get back to you right away, but I will always get back to you eventually. And I'm on Twitter. It is TAP Support.
Okay. Can you spell that?
TAP Support. Beverley
Okay.
Thomson at TAP Support.
Okay. Got it. Okay, so I think we're going to close now. Thank you so much, Beverly, for writing your book, and for coming and talking with all of us today and answering these questions. Oh, I wanted to mention too, Beverly did a great interview with Michaela Peterson that's on YouTube. So if anybody wants to
Thank you.
hear more from her, I think she asks you different questions, so you can go over to YouTube and watch that interview as well. And Angie can probably put that in the comments for you as well. Also the back of the book has a section of all kinds of resources.
Yeah.
As well. So if anybody needs resources, you can find them there. And then I'll just close. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. If you have not seen Medicating Normal, the film yet, you can go to our website, medicatingnormal.com, where you can rent it or buy a DVD. We always are scheduling more live interviews like this one, and you can find them under the events tab on our Facebook page. Previous interviews will be on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/medicatingnormal. And finally, if you'd like to support our outreach efforts to bring the film and more conversations like this one to communities worldwide, you can make a donation at medicatingnormal.com/donate. Thanks again, everybody, for being here today. Beverly, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and so good to meet you and read your book and hear all the great information you have to share. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be in touch, and keep us posted on book 2 and 3 and your website and everything else. So
I will too.
okay.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.